I'm Steve Boardman. I'm a professor of medieval Scottish history at the University of Edinburgh, and I specialise in 14th and 15th century Scottish history. Well, James Douglas's birth is supposed to have occurred around 1286, although nobody's particularly sure exactly when he's born. And that's a momentous year for the Scottish kingdom, because in that year, the Scottish king, Alexander III, dies, falling from his horse in Fife. And that's important because Alexander, who's reigned since 1249, dies without any legitimate heirs. His two sons have predeceased him, so has his daughter, but he does have a single infant granddaughter who's in Norway. And the so-called Maid of Norway is accepted as the likely heir to Alexander after his death. So it just remains for the Scottish realm, the representatives of the Scottish realm, to bring Margaret back to Scotland. But unfortunately, she dies on the way back in Orkney in 1290. And so that leaves the succession to the Scottish kingdom totally undecided. And in order to find a new king, the Scots have to go back up through the royal line to find the nearest cadet branches, the nearest collateral branches. And that comes down to a competition between two men, Robert Bruce and John Balliol, as to who has the best right to succeed to the Scottish throne. Up to 1286, the relationship between England and Scotland had been really pretty good. Alexander III was married to the sister of the English king, Edward I. And if you were looking for somewhere in Europe where a major war might break out, it would not be between England and Scotland. If you were looking at the relationship between the two kingdoms in the second half of the 13th century. But that all changes with Alexander III's death, and Edward I becomes involved in the debate over who should succeed him, the so-called Great Cause. Edward I is invited in as an arbiter, a judge of the cause, and he uses that position to put forward his own claims to be recognised as Lord Superior of the Scottish Kingdom, essentially taking advantage of the situation to increase his own power over the kingdom, adjoining his own. And so that becomes a matter of some tension afterwards. It takes a long time because there's, to begin with, a lot of claimants, at least 13 claimants. So it's a case of going through all the different claims and trying to verify them. Much like a court case nowadays, it can take a very long time for a decision to be reached. And so it takes about 2 years for that process to be carried through. And at the end of it, they decide in favour of John Balliol as having the better claim to the throne. And that seems to be the generally accepted result, except for Robert Bruce and his allies, who are not pleased with that result, and who look to undermine John Balliol's kingship after 1292. And they find that Edward I helps in that process of undermining John Balliol's power, because Edward wants John to live up to the promises that all the Scottish claimants had made in terms of recognising Edward's authority over Scotland. So again, the advantage he's taken of the gap in royal authority in Scotland comes back to be very disruptive after 1292. So James Douglas is really born into the world where Anglo-Scottish tension and Anglo-Scottish hostility is just beginning. He's just ramping up, and he will spend his entire life against that backdrop of violence and political tension between the two kingdoms. The decisive military moment comes in 1296 when Balliol is sort of pushed into resisting Edward I's various demands by members of his own nobility, his own aristocracy, and Edward comes north with a major army and destroys the major Scottish town at that point, trading town Berwick, and then defeats John Balliol's army at the Battle of Dunbar in 1296. Balliol flees northward for a while, and then surrenders to Edward and is ceremonially stripped of all the insignia that made him a king. The crown, the sceptre, and the royal tabard or surcoat. And thereafter, Edward imposes a type of colonial administration on Scotland. Scotland is run by English lords and English officials in the period after 1296. He takes away all the trappings of Scottish kingship, so the Stone of Scone, the Scottish royal regalia, the Scottish royal muniments, they're all transported south. So he's effectively saying there is no longer a kingdom of Scotland. And there's a type of prolonged resistance to that, very localised and not very well coordinated after 1296. And as part of that English clampdown, certain Scottish lords are deprived of their lands, including one, Sir William Douglas, who loses his estates, and that's, of course, Sir James Douglas's father. And there's various suggestions that William Douglas dies in English captivity or as a result of English action. So James grows up looking to recover his family's ancestral estates and perhaps to gain some measure of revenge for whatever has happened to his father, although it's unclear that the English administration is directly responsible for that. So he's a man who grows up with his overriding aim, I think, to restore his family's fortunes, which have been adversely affected by the actions of the English administration set up in Scotland after 1296. Yes, it's true that at the end of the 13th century, many lords across the British Isles and Ireland held lands in England, in Scotland, in Wales, and perhaps in Ireland. And so they regarded themselves as vassals of the English king for their English lands, the Scottish king for their Scottish lands. And that situation hadn't been particularly problematic until the two kingdoms and the two kings essentially went to war. And obviously, if the bulk of your lands, the bulk of your estates were in England, then you wanted to keep them safe, and you'd adhere to the English king, Edward I and his successors, and pursue their policies in Scotland. And conversely, if you were someone who only had Scottish lands and you found yourselves dispossessed of them, then you were really committed to throwing out English rule and destroying the English administration. And Douglas comes into that category. Douglas and his successors are people who are not cross-border landholders in a big way, and so their focus is clear and their interests are clear. So the Douglases become, right from the start, one of the most committed families one of the most pro-war families in Scotland, and whose historic mission becomes the recovery of Scottish lands for the Scottish realm, and in many cases the recovery of Scottish lands for the Douglases. There's very much a measure of self-interest there. Douglas seems to have joined Bruce relatively early. Bruce doesn't launch his campaign to, as he sees it, reclaim his kingdom until 1306. And Douglas is with him fairly soon after that. And it seems to be, as we were perhaps suggesting, that Douglas is looking for some greater cause, some leader who can give him a chance of recovering his own lands. That seems to be his principal aim to begin with. And then, of course, he recovers not just his own lands, but through warfare, he gets control of other lands. And so he becomes more and more invested in the Bruce cause, and the two men work very much hand in hand in terms of recovering what they regard as their own birthrights, their own inheritance. So increasingly, Douglas just becomes utterly invested in and committed to Bruce's claim to the kingship, and to the idea of destroying the English hold on the south of Scotland, because that's how he can defend his own lands and gain more lands. Yeah, interestingly, when you read Barbour's Bruce, which looks back 50 years after the events to describe both the career of Douglas and the career of Robert Bruce, it's quite clear that Douglas is very often fighting quite separately from Bruce. He is basing himself in the south of Scotland and launching these types of guerrilla campaigns against English garrisons, against English supply lines, while Bruce is off doing other things in other parts of Scotland, so that their cooperation together is occasional when they're pulling together bigger forces to do specific things. But Douglas is really the critical man for, if you like, contesting English control of the area that's actually easiest for the English king and English forces to control, that area around the borders and Lothian in Scotland. So Douglas is very much at the sharp end of the fighting, right the way through from 1306, and then he's occasionally to be found with Bruce in other locations in Scotland. But for the first, say, 3 years, he seems to be very much in Bruce's company, as Bruce is knocking over his opponents within Scotland. So there's references to Douglas appearing in battles in the west coast of Scotland at the Pass of Brander, also shuttling round the Isles with Bruce in his winter of exile between 1306 and 1307. So Douglas is important in these two ways, supporting Bruce in his own campaigns, and then also fighting almost an independent war in the south of Scotland as one of Bruce's trusted lieutenants. People have described him and Thomas Randolph as franchised warlords, that they're given the authority of the Scottish king and then say, go and get on with it. Bruce, I think, is the statesman. He's the public face. He is, of course, the man who's claiming to be king, and he has to show regal qualities. Douglas, I think, is probably, we would regard him in a modern context as really quite a scary person, that he's obviously committed, he's obviously a ruthless and a violent battlefield commander. Barber's Bruce, this long account, is full of what we'd now regard as borderline war atrocities, the way he deals sometimes with prisoners, the way he deals with people who are trying to surrender to him. There's a streak of mercilessness about the way that Douglas conducts his warfare, according to later accounts anyway, that is perhaps revealing of somebody who is very much a military man, and who seems at times to enjoy that the fear that his reputation casts on his opponents. That you're probably well aware of the famous tale that in 14th century north of England, mothers would use the lullaby, hush ye, hush ye, do not fret ye, the Black Douglas shall not get ye, almost portraying Douglas as this type of bogeyman figure, almost a nightmarish threat to people's well-being, because of course he's not just fighting within Scotland, he's also raiding into the north of England, these devastating raids, which in political terms are to try and get the English crown to acknowledge Bruce as king and the independence of the Scottish realm, but which for Douglas and the people who are participating are also quite profitable. They're raiding and they're taking goods or extorting ransoms from northern English towns. Yeah, and undoubtedly, and Barber, writing, as I say, much later, really stresses this idea that Douglas is the ultimate loyal knight. He is the man that Bruce can rely on above all others, and historians have pointed out that Barber is really constructing this image of Douglas as the ideal loyal knight, and so there's a little bit of literary license. But even at the time, within Bruce's own reign, we find things like the Emerald Charter, which is this big grant of lands and rights to James Douglas from Robert I. And it's called the Emerald Charter because along with the actual documentation comes this emerald ring. And that's typical of the type of gift that a lord might give to a favoured vassal. It's a reminder, physical reminder of the bond between them, the bond of loyalty and mutual respect. So I think that it's not all made up, that Douglas is really admired and appreciated by Robert I for his qualities. He may not be the man that you'd send in for diplomatic negotiations. He may not be the man that you'd use to impress people in a courtly setting, but he's undoubtedly the man that Bruce can look to for military activities, and he's just regarded as an absolutely reliable political ally. Yeah, the relationship between the two men does seem to become closer and closer, so much so that when Robert is making arrangements for the running of his kingdom, should he die without heirs, he does this quite early in his reign because he's not yet produced an heir. So in 1315 and again in 1318, Robert draws up what are called entails, saying what should happen in the kingdom after his death if he hasn't produced heirs. And in the 1318 entail, and then again later on in the 1320s, he says that the kingdom should be run, first of all, by Thomas Randolph, Earl of Murray, who's another big lieutenant of Robert I. And after Randolph, if Randolph dies without heirs, it should be James Douglas. So essentially, he's already been picked out by 1318 as the second most important man supporter for, as far as Robert I is concerned, the man he would be prepared to trust with looking after his realm, and after 1324, looking after his heir, David. So these are really quite significant indicators of Bruce's trust in James Douglas, even before the events of 1329, when he's chosen to go on the crusade with Bruce's heart. Yeah, in 1329, Bruce knows he's dying. He's gone on a long pilgrimage down to a shrine in the southwest of Scotland, perhaps seeking a cure, perhaps trying to make his peace with God. And Bruce does seem to be very aware of the danger that his soul is in, because from 1306 he has been involved in warfare. As Barber says, he is aware of the blood on his hands. And so one of the ways that you can reconcile yourself with God for a man of violence, for a man who's been involved in warfare, is by going on crusade. Now, Bruce realises that he's not going to be able to do that himself. He's on the way out. But he's looking for somebody to act as a proxy, to take his heart on crusade, to fulfil those crusading vows, or Robert's desire to go on crusade. And there's different stories about how Douglas is chosen. John Barber, who's writing the Bruce in the 1370s, suggests that Robert just asks his nobility and his knights to choose who they want to take the heart. And they choose Douglas. Douglas comes back in and Bruce says, "That's great, he's the person that I would have chosen." And that's significant, because what it's suggesting there is that it's not a royal choice. It's not something that the king decides, that it's the entire nobility of Scotland deciding that effectively Douglas is the worthiest knight of the realm. And that's very important for chivalric ways of ranking people's worth. That what it's saying is that everybody knows that Douglas is the best and worthiest knight. He should be given this task. So he becomes a representative not just of the king, but of the entire Scottish noble class. So when he boards ship and sets off, he's actually representing the entirety of the Scottish realm, not just Bruce. There is another interpretation where Bruce decides on Douglas, and everybody says, "Yeah, that's great," but that's not the internal Scottish tradition. Yes, it's interesting. There's been some work recently which has questioned just how important Douglas was at Bannockburn itself, and at least one scholar has suggested that Barber, who writes the most full account of Bannockburn from a Scottish perspective, makes up this leading role for Douglas, because Douglas's descendants are important in Barber's own time. And it seems likely that Douglas was simply a part of the Scottish army at Bannockburn, rather than one of its principal leaders. But there's no doubt that in terms of leading warfare over the border into England, that Douglas is very much one of the leading lights in Scottish military efforts in the early 14th century. And perhaps his most famous encounter is on the Weardale campaign. Weardale is an area in the north of England. And Douglas's raiding force meets a major English army with the young Edward III, very young Edward III commanding it. And we have accounts from a chronicler who was in the English force of this nighttime raid by Douglas through the English camp, in which they almost reach Edward III's royal pavilion, that he's very, very close to either killing or capturing the young English king. So that would probably be held up at the time as the greatest example of Douglas's daring and his military proficiency. But more generally, you just get the sense that Douglas fights an awful lot of small-scale battles. Later sources claim that he fights in over 70 and wins 57 of them, almost like the way that people calculate boxing records. He won 70, 15 by knockout and 43 on points. So I think rather than seeing him as somebody who plays a decisive role in all the major Scottish battles of the early 14th century, the big set piece battles, that he's somebody who's constantly involved in warfare and is winning all these small scale encounters all over the shop, and also appearing in bigger royal armies. It's always difficult to answer that type of counterfactual question is the way we'd frame it. What would have happened if this had happened instead of what actually happened? I think there'd certainly be a lot more English noblemen and knights who had a longer life in the early 14th century, and whether another figure would have emerged to do the Douglas role, that is a possibility. But you look at somebody who has that force of personality, that determination, that drive, you may be able to say, yes, things would have turned out differently, that the south of Scotland would not have been so difficult for the English king and the English king's representatives to control. And so therefore the course of the war overall might have been different if Douglas had never existed, or if he'd been killed in one of those earlier encounters after 1306. So difficult to say definitively, but you'd bet that the war would have taken a different course in some way or other. It could have been delayed. It may not have happened at all, of course, because all these things really do depend sometimes on chance, on the way that certain events fall. I mean, if Robert the Bruce had been killed early on, then I think the cause of an independent Scottish kingdom at that point would have been in serious trouble, for example. But yes, I mean, I think it's difficult to evaluate something that didn't happen, if you know what I mean. But what we can say is that Douglas is, by very, very soon after his death, he is regarded as one of the figures that has achieved and protected the independence of the Scottish kingdom through war. And so he becomes this really evocative figure especially for members of his own family, the Douglases, who go on to present themselves in 15th century. They describe themselves as the inheritors of James Douglas's mission. They are the war wall of the Scots. On the border, they're the Douglases. the English have to push through the Douglas war wall to affect the rest of the kingdom. And they glory in the idea that they've all died on the battlefield, generation after generation, which is the viewpoint. Most of the fighting is probably, as I was saying, quite small scale, quite small groups involved in ambushes and raids, occasionally bringing together larger forces for bigger campaigns or for set piece battles. So for the raids in the south of Scotland and the north of England, Douglas's forces are probably very mobile. They're probably all on horses, and a continental chronicler gives a very famous description of these Scottish forces as being mounted on small ponies, moving very fast, not having a baggage train. They're not bringing supplies with them. They just have a bag of oats, and they're making up their meals as they go along, very simply, and they're living off the land. And so they keep on appearing unexpectedly in different places and overpowering smaller groups and then disappearing again. So that's one style of warfare that's being conducted. Then there's the other one. There's the one for the big set-piece battles. And there, the Scottish armies are made up of general levies, general call-out of everybody between the ages of 16 and 60. Robert I develops this way of fighting with an infantry army. There's very little cavalry in the big Scottish armies, and they adopt these big hedgehog-like formations. They look like porcupines with lots of long pikes, and they're essentially defensive formations that are very difficult for cavalry to break into. And Bruce and his generals develop this strategy where he gets them really quite well organised, and they can move. They move just at walking pace, but that type of phalanx moving at you just at walking pace is actually quite effective as well. So the bulk of the armies are probably drawn from the peasant class. So they'd be quite lightly armoured. They'd wear these padded jackets called acatons, which are linen jackets but stuffed with horsehair, other forms of cloth, perhaps with chain mail over the top and a helmet. And their typical weapons obviously would be the pike, this big long 16, 20 foot spear, and many of them would also have swords and battle axes. So that's quite different from the mounted knights who would be heavily armoured, and main weapon would be, in certain contexts, the lance and the sword. And then of course there's bowmen as well, who form a different group. And who are again quite prominent in all these forces. I'm afraid I know nothing. I don't think anybody really has a good grasp of what goes on there. And of course, their intention may be to go to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, but the crusade, of course, never gets there because it comes to a shuddering halt in the south of Spain. So the implication is that the implication is that Douglas certainly takes with him a number of knights because they're mentioned in other accounts, and Bruce may well have made a bequest, monetary request, a bequest to pay for certain people to accompany Douglas. But Douglas also seems to have been made, and this speaks to his probably his contemporary fame and his reputation. He also seems to be made the commander of all the foreign knights, that is, all the knights who are not from Spain itself, in the expedition down to Teba. So how many he took with him is unclear, and even where he made landfall, where the ship went to, isn't all that clear. I think most historians think it's Valencia. Yeah, I can't say that I know a great deal about it, but the editor of Barber's Bruce, Archie Duncan, the edition of Barber's Bruce that was produced in the 1990s, he came down he thought that the most likely place was Valencia in Spain, looking at all the different accounts. So I can't say that it's something I know very much about personally, but the last major Scottish historian to look at it thought that Valencia was the likeliest option, but whether that's correct or not is I think still open. Yeah, there's nothing in the Scottish sources to say that he went to Santiago de Compostela. I mean, the intriguing thing, of course, is that he is named James, which would suggest that his family have got an interest in the cult of St. James, and perhaps it's an early nod to why they end up in Spain. Perhaps it's a family that has an interest in the Iberian Crusade even before they are delegated the task in 1329, because there's James as a personal name is adopted by several Scottish families in the second half of the 13th century, and it seems to be as a result of the growing fame of the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. So there's no evidence that he went there, but there's very little evidence, all told, for what he does before he gets himself killed at Teba. Well, there's a number of accounts preserved in Scottish sources, but most of those are relatively late. And his crusade is obviously quite widely advertised or promoted or commemorated in Europe, because it appears in the work of a chronicler from Flanders, the modern-day Belgium, Netherlands, called Jean Le Bel, who has a long account of the crusade and the people Robert Bruce choosing Douglas to go on that crusade. And then there's various English chronicles of the 1330s, so really quite close to the date of the crusade, who talk about James in very complimentary terms, saying he's a martyr and dies in defence of the Christian faith. Geoffrey Le Baker, he's called Geoffrey Baker, and he's also the person who talks about James as being the commander of all the foreign knights in that crusade. So there's some accounts from quite close to the event, but they're not as full as the later Scottish material, which might or might not involve an element of exaggeration or invention. But for the Scottish sources, James meets his end in a typically chivalric way. That he goes back to rescue some of his own knights, some of his own men who have got themselves in a perilous situation. I saw that as one of the questions, and I don't actually know where that story comes from. I'm afraid my expertise ends completely at 1500, and so any stories that develop after that, I'd genuinely not heard that story. I mean, he's obviously planning, or they're obviously planning right from the start to go to Spain, because the safe conduct that they get in 1329 says that they may be planning to go to the Holy Land, but first stop is going to be the Iberian Peninsula. So they're obviously planning to do something in Spain. So he's I'd be surprised if he expresses surprise or he doesn't want to get off the ship in Spain, because it's obviously part of the pre-tour itinerary. I don't know anything, and I do know that there's some other accounts which suggest, John Lebel suggests that, in fact, he places all this happening in Flanders. He says that he learns of the Spanish Crusade being planned by Alfonso the 11th, and just happens to join it. But as I say, it's clear that they're planning from the start to go to Spain. So I presume that they've got their itinerary worked out. I presume that they've actually pre-arranged in some way with Alfonso the 11th's representatives that they are on their way and wish to take part in it. It doesn't strike me as something that's arranged on the spur of the moment. It seems that they've got this in mind. Yeah, and undoubtedly that I think that's right. This is where they're planning to go. They may be planning to go further to other crusading venues, but they're certainly planning right from the start to go to Spain, and so in a sense it says something about the effectiveness of those crusading networks, those networks that advertise crusade, try to pull people in to participate in them. So obviously Alfonso the 11th is doing a good job, because he's getting this group of foreign knights, Douglas amongst them, to turn up to take part in this campaign. I think he probably is someone with a great reputation by that point. In fact, the three principal leaders of Scottish military effort in the period after 1306, Bruce, Thomas Randolph and Douglas, all seem to be figures who are respected outside Scotland. That normally doesn't happen for a Scottish knight or a Scottish king, but the three of them, and in some senses the fame of the three of them may be strengthened by acting as a sort of type of group, that their reputation is known throughout Europe. And that tale of the Douglas Crusade, for example, is obviously circulating well beyond Scotland. And people know about Robert Bruce when he dies, and people in Italy and the Low Countries and England and Scandinavia are saying, he was a great warrior king. And alongside him, I think Douglas, because of that association, partly because of that association, partly because of his own reputation, is well known. And Barber has this quite well-known episode where a knight sees Douglas at a feast during that continental campaign and says, "Well, I didn't expect you to look like that. There's not a mark on your face. I was expecting some battle-scarred veteran, looking like Rambo or Vin Diesel, really beaten up, and Douglas famously replies, I look like this because I've got hands. I've got hands to defend myself. What have you been doing wrong? But that idea that actually his fame precedes him in a sense. The Scottish chronicles, Scottish accounts, tend to suggest that Douglas is successful in launching this assault on the Moorish army. He perhaps doesn't receive the support that he needs from the rest of the army, is on his way back, and sees some of his men in trouble and goes to try and rescue them. And so he dies in this heroic, chivalric way, the lone Christian knight fighting against the Moorish host. There are other accounts, including a contemporary Spanish source, which seems to suggest that a group of knights, the foreign knights in Alfonso's army, charge prematurely and too eagerly and get themselves cut up. And it seems likely, about what we know of Douglas, that might well be him, although he's never identified in that Spanish chronicle. If he is in charge of the foreign knights in the army, then that looks as if it could be him. So dying on the day before the main battle. And so that gives rise to this different tradition that Douglas is just so keen to get into the fight, so keen to start the crusade, so keen to live up to the charge, the obligation, the responsibility that's been placed on him, that it sort of overwhelms his military sense, and it's just sort of helm down and charge. So those are the two strands of thought, two explanations of what goes on, because it's, in some ways, given his career, a reckless charge does not really seem Douglas's way of making war. He's normally quite cautious and pragmatic. So you pays your money and you takes your choice, I think. Yeah, that's certainly the explanation that's provided in the contemporary Spanish account, that the Moorish army is very adept at making these feints, these false moves to try and draw unwary opponents into a full frontal attack from where they can be repulsed and then surrounded. And the Spanish Chronicles seems to suggest that all the Spanish troops under Alfonso XI, they've seen this before, so they're literally sitting on their horses just waiting for it all to end. And then they look right and see the foreign knights just sort of charging in. So that is a possible explanation. That's a tactical blunder. And in a career that long, and placing yourself into danger that many times, sometimes mistakes happen. Yeah, the medieval Scottish accounts don't mention Douglas's heart at all in this context. They say that after the battle, a man called Sir William Keith of Galston in Ayrshire recovers Robert the Bruce's heart from the battlefield, which had been carried by Douglas. But Douglas himself, because they don't have the facilities to embalm him, they disembowel him and boil him and take all the flesh off the bones and just take the bones back for burial. So there's nothing in these Scottish accounts to suggest that a Douglas heart comes back. But there is this, his bones are brought back and buried in St Bride's Kirk in Douglasdale, in his territorial heartland. So the bones are brought home. To be honest, I'm not quite sure where that story begins, and where it's first attested. It's not one that I know anything about, and I don't think it's a medieval Scottish tradition that Douglas's heart comes back. But there may be. It may be early modern or later. But of course the heart imagery is so important for the Douglases, because they change their coat of arms to have Bruce's heart placed on the centre of their shield, and throughout the late medieval period they make allusions to their role as the bearers of Bruce's heart and the family that have been blessed by Bruce. And very famously, there's a poem in the mid-15th century called The Book of the Hewlet, the Book of the Owl, where they have this discussion of the Douglas heraldry as it then is, and they emphasise their continuing role as the bearers of Bruce's legacy, because they bear Bruce's bloody heart, as they describe it, on their shield. So it literally becomes a type of emblem of the family, that they really commemorate Douglas's death, but more importantly, Douglas's death carrying Bruce's heart into battle and on crusade in 1329. As a personal, I'm sorry, is it? Is that somebody coming? No.
We can continue.
Yeah, but my own thought is probably that his heart was amongst the material, shall we say, deposited in Taba. And that it probably wasn't brought back. Having said that, Bruce, Randolph, and you suspect Douglas, do have an interest in separate heart burials, because Robert Bruce was not the only member of the Scottish aristocracy to ask for a separate heart burial. Thomas Randolph did as well. So it could be that the knights with Douglas were aware that this was significant for him and would have made an attempt to bring his heart back. It's just not recorded in any of the contemporary Scottish sources. And my suspicion is, given Barbara's description, that they would have said in the 1370s if there'd been a special attempt to bring Douglas's heart back. But Barbara just mentions the bones that are interred in St Bride's Kirk in Douglasdale. For Bruce's heart, I think it's fairly clear cut that it's brought back, and we have from Barbara's account the suggestion that Thomas Randolph, who's the only one of the big three left, he arranges for the burial of the heart at Melrose Abbey on the Anglo-Scottish border, which is an interesting choice in many ways. It's a place that is actually on the frontier between the two realms. So it's almost putting Bruce's heart on the front line in a way. And it's interesting in terms of subsequent developments, because Melrose becomes one of those religious institutions that is very much defended by the Douglases through the 14th century. So in a strange way, they continue to act as loyal knights to Bruce and the defenders of Bruce's heart in its new location in Melrose Abbey. Now, of course, the Abbey itself was one of the places that were partially destroyed or let to fall into ruin during the Scottish Reformation in the 16th century. But in 1920, when people were doing archaeological work on the Abbey, they uncovered a casket with some form of organic remains in it, and it was thought that that was the casket with Bruce's heart in it. It was reburied in a lead container, and then 70 years later, in 1996, another archaeological investigation dug up the same thing, and there was talk about doing some sort of DNA testing at the time, but the material didn't allow it, so it was reburied in 1998, and it's still there, still marked now as the likely burial spot for Bruce's heart. Whether it is Bruce's heart is again open to debate, because it wasn't found near the high altar. It was found in a more business-like part of the monastery, and we do know there were other heart burials there. But as of now, people point to this reburied heart of 1998 as where Bruce's last remains are in terms of a heart. And of course his body is buried separately in Dunfermline Abbey in Fife. Douglas Hart, I don't know. Again, an interesting counterfactual, but in this case we can probably say a bit more, because we know about the other arrangements that Bruce has set up before he dies. So Bruce has arranged that after his death, his young son, David, will be looked after by Thomas Randolph, who will be guardian and lieutenant of the kingdom until David comes of age. And there's a further step in that arrangement that if Thomas Randolph dies, then James Douglas would be guardian and lieutenant for the young king and for the kingdom. And of course, Thomas Randolph does die of natural causes in July 1332. So if James Douglas had still been alive and was still around, James Douglas would effectively have been guardian and lieutenant of the kingdom for the years after 1332, for however long he would have lasted. And that's an interesting counterfactual, because one of the things that happens in 1332 after Randolph's death is that the Wars of Independence are revived by an English invasion force headed by Edward Balliol, the son of the John Balliol who'd been got rid of or pushed aside by Bruce in 1306. And the Scottish armies of the 1330s do very badly, and it's at least partly because the three main military leaders are all gone, Bruce, Randolph and Douglas. So if Douglas had survived the crusade, come back and was in command of Scottish armies in 1332, then we might have seen a very different outcome from those Anglo-Scottish encounters of the 1330s, and perhaps a bit more Scottish success or competence. It's interesting because, like many of the figures of the Wars of Independence, other than Bruce himself. Douglas has sort of faded from popular recognition a wee bit now. In the 19th century, people were putting up statues of him. He appears in that, I don't know if you've seen it, the frieze in the Scottish National Gallery, which has all these great figures from Scottish history, so put up in the early 20th century. There are a couple of railway locomotives named after him. So that there's very much a culture of commemoration of James Douglas in the 19th and early 20th century. Perhaps less pronounced now, but you still get whiskey named after him. You can buy a bottle of the Black Douglas, and this may say something about Scotland. You can also get a beer named after him, the Black Douglas, from a nearby brewery, Broughton Brewery, in Edinburgh. So Douglas is sort of now being commemorated in a way that might actually make you forget Douglas and everything else if you take too much of the product. So still remembered, but probably not as much as he was commemorated, certainly in the medieval, early modern period, and perhaps even in the 19th and early 20th century. I think now people are, and you know, this is a European-wide phenomenon, people are slightly suspicious now of figures who are seen to represent those type of national sentiments quite so strongly. Especially when it's linked to somebody who had that capacity for violence and whose chief claim to fame is war in the medieval period. So fashions may have changed slightly around James Douglas, but he's still remembered. Not necessarily fondly, but he's still remembered as a formidable figure. No, and actually the material you sent through the files stuff was a bit of an eye opener. I hadn't realised that he was quite so well remembered in the context of his final battle and the location thereof in Tabor. And perhaps it doesn't need to go on the camp, but has this been running a long time, this festival, or is it